after a suspension that rocked the NBA, Paul George is firing back at critics. But insiders say PG might be deflecting heat, possibly toward LeBron. Now, an NBA owner's announcement has the league on edge. Is this damage control or the start of something bigger? Let's get into it. It started with the fall of Paul George. On January 31st, 2026, the NBA dropped a bombshell that nobody saw coming. And when I say nobody, I mean not a single soul in the basketball world had this on their radar. The league came out and announced that Philadelphia 76ers forward Paul George, a 9-time All-Star, one of the most gifted two-way players of his generation, had been suspended without pay for 25 games for violating the NBA anti-drug program. 25 games gone just like that. Now, to really understand how devastating this was, you have to look at the timing. Paul George is in his second season with the Philadelphia 76ers after signing a massive 4-year, approximately $212 million contract in July 2024. This was supposed to be the year that everything came together for the Sixers. They had their big three, George, Joel Embiid, and Tyrese Maxey, and after years of heartbreak and playoff disappointments, Philly was finally supposed to be a serious contender. And here's the thing that makes it sting even more. Just 4 days before the suspension dropped, Paul George had played what many called his best game as a Sixer, dropping 32 points with 9 3-pointers against the Portland Trail Blazers on January 27th. He was cooking. He looked like the Paul George everybody remembered from his Indiana Pacers and LA Clippers days, and then boom, suspended. The league didn't say exactly what substance was involved. They cited privacy under the collective bargaining agreement, but the basketball world is smart. People know the rules. A 25-game suspension lines up perfectly with a first-time violation for what the NBA calls drugs of abuse, a category that includes substances like cocaine, methamphetamine, opioids, PCP, LSD, and ketamine. This is not the same as getting caught with marijuana, which barely gets you a slap on the wrist these days. And it's definitely not the same as performance-enhancing drugs like steroids, which carry an 80-game suspension for a first offense. So whatever Paul George took, it fell right in that middle category. Bad enough to get you 25 games, but not PED level bad. Now, Paul George knew he had to get in front of this, so he released a statement through ESPN's Shams Charania, and this is where things got interesting. He said, I've discussed the importance of mental health, and in the course of recently seeking treatment for an issue of my own, I made the mistake of taking an improper medication. And that right there is the part that made everybody pause. He framed the whole thing around mental health. He said he was seeking treatment, and along the way, he took something he wasn't supposed to take. Now, on the surface, that sounds like the right thing to say. He took responsibility, he apologized, but a lot of people in the media were not buying it, not even a little bit. Took some enhancement drugs to make you better on the court, but then you blame it on mental health. Can we just stop the man? Just admit it. You cheated. You need a little bit extra kicker. That reaction right there was shared by a lot of folks across the sports media landscape. The feeling was that Paul George was using mental health, something that is very real and very important, as a shield, as a way to soften the blow and make people feel sorry for him instead of holding him accountable. Just admit it. Just admit it. You're getting older here. You're feeling the weight of that contract. You want to make sure that you're a good player on the Philadelphia 76ers. And that's what a lot of people were thinking, but didn't want to say out loud. Paul George is 35 years old. He's battled injuries his entire career. Foot surgeries, knee problems, shoulder issues, you name it. He just signed one of the biggest contracts in NBA history. The pressure to perform was immense. And maybe, just maybe, he took something to help himself feel better, play better, recover faster, and then tried to dress it up as a mental health issue when he got caught. I mean, the fact that he deflected and made it about mental health was just crazy. Just own it and move on, because Donnie, nobody will care in another week. But Paul George didn't just own it. He wrapped it in the language of mental health advocacy. And that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Now, here's the other side of this, the money side. The suspension cost George approximately $11.7 million in lost salary based on his $52.8 million salary for the season prorated per game. That is a staggering amount of money to lose. But for the Sixers ownership, this suspension actually created an opportunity. And that's where things get really interesting. See, before the suspension, the Sixers were sitting about $7 million over the luxury tax threshold. When a player gets suspended and isn't getting paid, that money doesn't count against your cap. So suddenly the Sixers went from being $7 million over to only about $1.25 million over the luxury tax line. And if you're Josh Harris, the owner of the 76ers, and you're looking at the reality of what your team is, you're doing the math real quick. You're thinking, we didn't do this. We didn't make a trade. Our player got suspended for his own mistake, and now we're just a sliver away from getting under the tax and saving ourselves millions. When you've got a team together that's finally winning, they put it together, you swallow hard, and you realize that you made the plan to be over. That's the reality of the business side of the NBA. Sometimes a player's mistake becomes an owner's opportunity. And with the trade deadline sitting right there on February 5th, the Sixers had a very real chance to make a move to duck under that luxury tax line entirely. And that brings us to the bigger picture. Because as bad as this was for Paul George and for the Sixers' on-court chemistry, something else happened in the aftermath that nobody predicted. Paul George's suspension, his explanation, his excuses, and the whole mess surrounding it accidentally ripped the lid off a conversation that the NBA has been trying to keep quiet for years. A conversation about who else in the league might be taking things they shouldn't be taking. A conversation about double standards. A conversation about the biggest name in basketball history. And that conversation was about to get very loud very fast. The Whisper Network, LeBron James, and the Open Secret. Now, here's where the Paul George story takes a turn that nobody expected, because the moment PG got suspended and tried to explain it away with mental health, people in the basketball world started asking a very dangerous question. If Paul George gets suspended for 25 games for taking an improper medication, then why isn't the league looking at everybody else? And by everybody else, they didn't mean some role player on the bench. They meant LeBron James. This is not a new accusation. This is something that has been bubbling underneath the surface of professional basketball for years. But Paul George's suspension cracked the dam wide open and let everything flood out at once. So let's walk through exactly how this unfolded, because it involves some of the biggest names in sports, current players, retired legends, MMA fighters, and even the founder of the most infamous doping lab in American history. It starts with a man named Chael Sonnen. For those who don't know, Sonnen is a former UFC middleweight contender, an ESPN MMA analyst, and a man who has been very open about his own history with performance-enhancing drugs. He failed multiple drug tests during his fighting career, including a 2014 bust for EPO and human growth hormone that led to a 2-year ban. So when Chael Sonnen talks about PEDS, he's not speaking from the outside looking in. He's speaking from personal experience. And back in March of 2023 on the Flagrant podcast with Andrew Schultz, Sonnen said something that shook the entire sports world. There's only one. We have the same drug guy if you know exactly what he's doing. Let that sit for a second. A man who has personally used EPO, who has been caught and punished for using EPO, just went on a major podcast and said he shares the same supplier as LeBron James. And he wasn't done. EPO matters. It's the reason LeBron takes it. It matters. And if other basketballs understood what it did, EPO increases your red blood cells, which gives you endurance so you can play all game long. So, according to Sonnen, EPO is the reason LeBron James at 41 years old can still play 35 minutes a night and look like he hasn't lost a single step. He called EPO the king of performance enhancers and compared LeBron's regimen to what he called the Lance Armstrong diet: EPO, human growth hormone, and testosterone. He even went on the PBD podcast in February 2024 and doubled down, saying he and James use the same dealer and he sees nothing wrong with it. Now, you might be thinking this is just one guy and he's from the MMA world, so maybe nobody in basketball took it seriously, but that's where you'd be wrong, because the very next big name to weigh in was a Hall of Famer who spent his career going head-to-head with LeBron on the basketball court.